All right, let's jump right into this explainer and unpack a highly provocative source text dating back to May 25th, 2010. Today, we're going to look at a document that makes some incredibly striking metaphysical claims about Chinese historical figures, specifically focusing on the former supreme leader of China, Deng Xiaoping. What we're examining here is presented as a spiritual message, which is essentially framed as an interview conducted from beyond the grave. Now, regardless of your personal beliefs about the spiritual realm, this text provides a truly fascinating, almost allegorical framework to re-examine history, statecraft, and the very nature of power itself.
To hook you right away, the source material asks us to imagine a pretty profound scenario. You ever wonder what actually happens to a supreme, purely materialistic leader when they, cross over into the spirit world? We usually judge historical leaders by the monuments they leave behind or the economic graphs of their nation. But this source asks us to look at the spiritual ledger. When a leader who fundamentally denied the existence of a higher power and prioritized absolute control above all else finally passes on, where exactly do they go? Well, according to the spiritual message captured in this text, the transition is absolutely not a peaceful one. The source depicts Deng Xiaoping as utterly confused upon his initial awakening in the afterlife. He's actually quoted as saying, what is this? Am I not on Earth anymore? He's portrayed as suddenly realizing that he's lost all his earthly power and is trapped in a terrifying, unfamiliar realm. He isn't peacefully sitting on a cloud. He's in a state of profound shock and total disorientation.
So here is our roadmap for today's explainer. First, Deng Xiaoping's afterlife state. Second, the true aim of reform and opening. Third, meeting Hitler in the afterlife. And finally, the worst consequence of materialist states.
Okay, let's dive into Section 1, Deng Xiaoping's afterlife state.
The text absolutely does not hold back here. It literally dedicates its core chapters to describing the former supreme leader's descent. The source details his destination after death, describing him plunging into this grim, hellish, underground realm, kind of like being stuck at the very bottom of a deep, dark well. It sets an incredibly dark stage right from the jump.
The text claims that right now, in the spirit world, Deng is experiencing a severe physical punishment. He describes being pulled down at immense speeds, trapped tens of thousands of meters underground in a subterranean prison, and the source is crystal clear on the why. This is framed as the direct, inescapable spiritual consequence of his materialistic, strong-arm politics. Specifically, it points to the brutal suppressions of human rights that occurred under his regime, like the Tiananmen Square incident. The idea is that the absolute power he wielded to crush people in life is now spiritually crushing him in death.
Moving right along to Section 2, the true aim of reform and opening.
We really need to contrast the mainstream history with the intense claims made in this book. Usually, the mainstream view paints Deng's reform and opening up policy as a pragmatic economic miracle, right? Something designed to lift citizens out of poverty and slowly integrate China into a democratic global order. But the source material flips that completely on its head. Through this spiritual interview, it claims the whole thing was a massive deception. The text asserts democratization was never the goal. Instead, it was a highly calculated strategy to deceive the West, steal their tactics, which the text calls stealing the enemy's art of war, and extract funds purely to expand their military.
The text actually points to the 1989 Tiananmen Square incident as grim proof of this hidden agenda. In the West, it's often viewed as a tragic derailment of progress. But this source asserts that when students demanded freedom, they were militarily crushed because democratic reform fundamentally contradicted the state's true hidden objective, maintaining absolute top-down military control.
According to the spirit of Deng in the text, economic growth was merely a tool. The real motivation was to use the allure of a massive consumer market to extract Western funds and technology. That newfound wealth, it wasn't meant for the everyday happiness of the citizen. It was meant to fuel the state apparatus and strictly supercharge the nation's armed forces. As the quote puts it, to earn money and expand the military is China's basic root.
Which brings us to Section 3, meeting Hitler in the afterlife.
This is where the text gets incredibly provocative. The source constructs a scenario in the spirit world where Deng Xiaoping allegedly crosses paths with Adolf Hitler, and in this spiritual dialogue, Deng is said to acknowledge a dark strategic parallel between his own methods of governance and those of Nazi Germany. He reflects on how both systems utilized rapid economic mobilization to mask much darker, aggressive state ambitions.
The spiritual message literally has Deng admitting, "I partly copied Hitler's economic recovery policies. So the narrative actively frames Deng's much-lauded economic miracle not as a triumph of the free market, but as a strategy directly inspired by totalitarian methods, a system where the economy is completely subservient to the ultimate power of the state.
The book draws some very stark parallels here between the two regimes. It emphasizes the claim that controlling a massive population inevitably breeds a system reliant on a despotic ruler, an absolute monarch. It aligns their use of economic recovery as a smokescreen for military buildup, their total suppression of individual human rights to lock down state power, and ultimately their shared, dangerous ambitions for global hegemony.
Finally, let's look at Section 4, the worst consequence of materialist states.
To really grasp the author's warning, we have to define materialism exactly how the book does. We aren't just talking about, liking expensive things. In this context, materialism is a systemic philosophy that fundamentally rejects spiritual truth, divine will, and inherent human rights. Instead, it places absolute priority on earthly, tangible metrics, hoarding money, consolidating state power, and expanding military force at absolutely any cost.
The source argues that in a materialist state like this, the social contract is completely flipped upside down. Regular citizens simply do not have inherent value. They're merely tools for the state's survival, basically economic engines meant to fund the military. The text claims that in this modern setup, the national leader essentially operates as a modern-day emperor with completely unchecked authority, hoarding all the human rights for themselves while completely denying them to the populace.
And that brings us to the author's stark conclusion. The source puts forward the idea that any nation built purely on stolen wealth and military force, a nation that actively suppresses human rights and denies spiritual realities, is essentially on a ticking clock. The text concludes that chasing pure financial and military power will inevitably lead to what it calls the worst results, namely complete self-destruction and ruin.
So I want to leave you with this final thought-provoking question from our explainer today. Regardless of how you personally interpret the spiritual framing of this source text, it really forces a powerful question. What is the ultimate fate of a nation guided strictly by absolute power rather than fundamental human principles? Does the pursuit of wealth and military might at the direct expense of human rights lead to a lasting triumph? Or, as the text warns, does it guarantee inevitable collapse? It's definitely a fascinating lens through which we can continuously evaluate history and the world around us. Thank you so much for joining me, and I encourage you to keep questioning the deeper narratives behind the history we're all taught.